Okay, good evening, everyone, and welcome back to the Halacha class. Tonight, we're going to we've already talked about immersing pots and pans once you buy them from non-Jews. Now we're going to talk about kashering them. So if they were used, what is required? So here, we're going to go to a source we've already seen before. And that's in a Mishnah in Masechet Avodah Zarah, and it says, "Halokeach klei tashmish min ha'odei kochavim." If one purchases utensils from non-Jews, and et shedakol hatbil yat bil, that which is the manner they require going into the mikveh, and you put them in the mikveh. So that's we already talked about that. Lahagil yagil, that which requires being purged in boiling water, you purge it in boiling water. Ben baor, ben baor, that which requires being heated in a hot fire, that's what you do. And it says there, hashipud va'askala melabnen baor. And therefore he says a spit, or what's called a shapud, and an haskala, which is a grill. They must be heated until white hot in the fire. And a sakin, a knife, you just polish it and it's rendered pure. So here, from that very basic Mishnah, which makes it sound very straightforward, it's a little bit more complicated, and we break it down into 5 categories here. And we have libun chamor, which is placing it in fire at a very high temperature, what's known as white hot, and this is very hard. Then there's libun kal, placing it in fire at a lower temperature. Then we have hagala kli rishon, where you put the utensil inside into a large pot while there's boiling hot water while it's on the fire. And then we have iruri from a kli rishon, where you pour boiling water onto something. And finally, you have hagala in a kli sheni, something which is not basically with hot water that was boiled in the fire, but then you transfer it to a different vessel, which again is the lowest category. So therefore, we have those 5 types of things. We have to basically decide what requires what. And there's a general rule here, and it's called kebol'ah kach polto, which means as it absorbs the flavor, so it emits it. And this is a teaching from Masechet Pesachim, Daf Lamed Amud Bet, and it says, Amar Rav Huna Bereid Rav Yehoshua. If I have an etz parur, a wooden ladle, magila berotchin uvekli rishon, it can be purged in boiling water inside of a inside of a vessel. The vessel has the fire is on underneath it. Why is that? Kasavar, says the Gemara, he holds kabol'o kach polto. He holds in accordance with the principle, as it absorbs the flavor of the forbidden substance, so the forbidden substance is emitted, goes out of it. And this principle is further elucidated later on Daf Ayin Hei Amud Bet in Masechet Avodah Zarah. Tanu Rabbanan, our rabbis taught in a Braita, Halokeach klei tashmish min ha'odei kochavim, one who purchases utensils from non-Jews, devarim shelo nishtamish bahen matbilin vehen torin. If they've never been used before, you immerse them in the mikveh and they're good to go. That's what we learned a few weeks ago. Devarim shenishtamesh bahen ayidei tzonein, things which they used for food but they were cold, kagon kosot, like cups, kutoniyot, jugs, tzluchiyot, flasks, madichan, all you need to do is rinse them, or matbilan, and immerse them in the mikveh, and they're pure, they're good to go. But things which were used through heat, kagon, hayorot, hakumkumosion, for example, large pots or kettles, Magilan or matbilan. There you have to immerse them in boiling water, and then they will be immersed in the mikveh, and they'll be used, good to go. And things which were used, i.e. they came directly into contact with fire, kagon, shpudin, askalot, such as spits and grills and the like. Melabnin umatabilan behentorin. Those require this libun chamor, this white heat, and then they can go into the mikveh and they are pure. So as we've established here, the mikveh is to go from non-Jewish ownership to Jewish ownership. But the kashering process, we have to do this, what's known as kabbalah kachpolto. The way that it's used is the way that the flavor will go out. So if it's only in contact with boiling water, then it's kasher through boiling water. But if it goes through fire, it's going to require fire. Now, in the next source, what happens if we have utensils which are used for multiple things? Sometimes it's used for hot water. Other times it's used for other things. How do we, and sometimes it's used for baking or cooking directly with the fire. How do we rule on that? And the Rashbam and the Rashba say we go after Rov, we go after the majority. So he says here in source number 4, Shelo halachu behechsher hakelim, ela achar ikar tashmishan. We only follow the primary usage concerning hechsher kelim. So if it's mainly used through boiling water, with hot water, then that's what we go by. Whereas the Bet Yosef also quotes the position of the Raviyah. And the Raviyah is an Ashkenazic Rishon. And he says, even though most of it is used through a klei sheni, we are concerned about the minority of times that it was used for a kli rishon. And therefore, you'll see that here we have a machloket, Maran and Ramah, of Sephardic and Ashkenazic position. For Sfaradim, we follow the more lenient position, and we go after Rov Tashmish. We go after the majority of the usage of the utensil. Therefore, with regard to pots, even though they are sometimes used as a kli rishon on the fire, since the majority of their usage is through pouring, i.e. the one pours on them from a kli rishon, that is their method of kashering. V'yesh machmirin, but the Rama adds, there are those who are strict to perform hagalah on the pots using any utensil, i.e. on the fire, and that is the minhag, v'hen hu minhag, that is the custom in Ashkenazic lands. And the same is true for anything that one must be concerned that it was used in kli rishon, such as spoons and the like. And some are stringent to perform hagalah on all cups, even though they are used for cold, since sometimes one uses them for hot liquids. And that is the custom to perform hagalah both post facto, but the avad sagi lehu b'shtifa. Then, but after the fact, rinsing is sufficient. So I'm just going to stop here and take the questions. Yes.
So, for instance, these electric pots to warm water, or a teapot that's only used to warm water, let's say for coffee or tea, is let's say if it's a non-kosher restaurant, let's say, or you go into a coffee shop. What is the ruling then that you can't take the hot water from that utensil or appliance?
Now that would be fine. Again, if generally what we're going through a few general rules first, but to answer your question directly, Sarah, that if we know that it's straight boiling water from the kettle, then that's why it's allowed. That's why going into a Starbucks, If you know what if you're ordering a very basic coffee and you know all the ingredients are kosher, that's why you can take the boiling water and they can add all the things in there for you. It gets a little bit more complicated in a restaurant, because in a restaurant you've got a different issue, which is maritime, that someone might think that you're doing more than just having a tea or a coffee at that place. But to answer your question, the boiling water itself would not be an issue. But understanding this question, it's a practical case about using cups. So if I use cups and they're always cold, for Sfaradim, even if a couple of times it may have been used for a hot drink, there would be no kashering needed to go from a year-round use to go for a Pesach use. So for example, Kiddush cups and the like, they would not need boiling water. Whereas the Ashkenazic practice is that even for Pesach, they would take Kiddush cups, which are only used for grape juice or wine, that the minhag in the Ashkenaz is to immerse them in boiling water. Whereas for Sfaradim, the practice is just to clean them, and that is enough, or just polish them, as it were.
Rabbi?
Yes.
It seems like in so many other aspects of halakha, right, where we're sort of almost obsessed with building a fence around things. Why are we okay not building a fence around it here?
So we want to understand the scientific reason, as it were. They have created a halachic system of kabbalah kachpolta, that the way it absorbs flavor is the way that the flavor is going to go out. They are concerned that there is flavor in the sides, in the walls of these pots. And so therefore, they've created a way of doing it. And they're going to explain now, if we rule stringently and say everything requires white hot heat, or everything requires a more severe way of kashering. So let's say it's only a kli sheni, and we're going to say it requires kli rishon, or if it's cold, we're going to say it needs to be heated. The problem is that some vessels and some pots and pans will actually be ruined by that. And so therefore, if it's going to be ruined, what are we worried about? That whoever's doing the kashering won't do it properly. And so therefore, the Sephardic approach, I think, was one of, and I think Ashkenazic in general also, was there's only so much people are willing to do, and they're not willing to ruin their pots and pans or their baking trays. And so therefore, because of that concern, we're not going to be overly strict. And we're going to play with the rule of kabbalah kachpolta, and we're going to apply that across the board. And that will work for us, because if we're too strict on the system, then the system will break.
I mean, I get that for certain things, but coming back to the example of spoons, right? Take the teaspoons that sit in your drawer. Maybe most of the time, let's say you use them for a cold drink, right? Whatever that happens to be. But every now and then, you know, if you have some guests over, you serve them tea and you use the same spoons. That's not something that's going to be ruined by boiling it. I mean, generally speaking, right?
True, and I think you're speaking out to the position of the Raviyah, and that was the Raviyah's position was, you know, it doesn't matter if it's a 1 in 100 or 1 in 10 or 1 in 3. We're going to go with what is the time that it's used for. If it's used ever for hot water, then it's going to require that type of kashering. Exactly right. To what degree are the Sfaradim more lenient on this phrase? Why don't they hold kabbalah kachpolta for minority? I don't know. I think we'd have to bring the Rambam back and ask him. I mean, he's pretty weighty. I'm happy to go with him.
Seems reasonable.
Yeah. So, continuing on this, the Mishnah Berurah, and he writes as well in his Shah HaTziyun, say, L'chatchila the Ashkenazim require the higher degree of will go by the minority. However, that's in the chatchila b'diavad samchinan ad de'ar rishona. Then they are reliant on the first position. And this is from the Eliyah Rabbah, Chok Yaakov, Mekor Chaim, and the Graz, and also see the Pri Megadim, who questions this even concerning B'di Avad, but it's clear that when it is not Ben Yomo, when it's been more than 24 hours, we can rely upon all these poskim to be lenient. And here in the notes, it says, an important practical difference, what's known as a nafka mina, between these two opinions, arises concerning kashering silverware or a countertop before Pesach. So here's what we talked about. According to the Shulchan Aruch and Sephardic practice, one would need to only kasher them in a keli sheni, since silverware is usually used for bowls and plates. According to the Ramah and Ashkenazic practice, one would need to kasher them in a kli rishon, i.e. placing them in a pot of boiling hot water on the fire. Another practical difference arises concerning kashering says the same thing twice. Okay, so there you go. You just need to read the first paragraph. Second paragraph's just repeated. So there you go. That would be an issue there of how you're doing it. Are you putting them into a large pot on the fire, or are you, or does it not need to be on the fire anymore? And that's the difference of what temperature it's going to be like. Is it going to be 120 Fahrenheit? Is it going to be 200 Fahrenheit? Is it going to be, and how hot does it have to really be to make that difference? Okay, now carrying on, we're going to talk about this libun, because as I said, John, just to hold on a second, you're really right. There's very few things which are going to be damaged by boiling water. However, there are lots of things which are going to be damaged by libun, which is basically taking a blowtorch to them. And, I'm happy with boiling or steaming or whatever. The blowtorches, I get a little bit concerned that, someone's going to get hurt, or just buy a new pot. I'm not a big fan of libun. I think you're going to end up just causing a lot of black, or worse, could be some sort of issue here. So it says here, libun refers to kashering by placing utensil directly in fire, which is derived from the pasuk referring to the Jewish peoples taking utensils from Midian after defeating them in battle. This is the method of kashering required for utensils used for baking without a liquid medium, such as baking pans and utensils used in grilling or roasting. So how hot must the fire be to achieve this? There's actually a machloket between the Yerushalmi and the Bavli. The Yerushalmi says you have to see sparks coming out of it. Halibun tzarich sheyihu nitzotzot mitnazin mimena. Okay, you have to see the sparks coming out of it. Whereas in the Bavli, it says, Vlad kama melabnen, amar Ravmani, ad shetashir klipatan, until they shed their outer layer. So how do we understand these? Are these two separate things? According to the Rosh, these two variants in the Bavli and the Yerushalmi are actually the same thing. They're two different ways of describing the same temperatures. He writes here, how much does one heat to make them white hot? Until they shed their outer layer. And in the Yerushalmi, libun must raise sparks from it. And the Rosh writes this in a responsum. Okay? In contrast, some Rishonim, such as the Hagot Maimoniot, quote Rav Avigdor, who holds that the utensil only need to be heated to the temperature at which straw would be burned if it were placed on the utensil, which is a much lower than the temperature described by the Gemara. Okay? It says here, Matzati b'shem harav Avigdor Katz, she'im melabno ad she'im yasim alav kash, yunitzotzot nitazin mimeno, sagi b'hachi. That's enough. If you just put some straw, that it will catch fire. Because if you don't say this, oto trapa, then concerning the tarpa, which is a type of utensil, she'ofin tachta pashtida, which we use it to bake a pashtida, which In yeshiva, we called it a kugel, but here it says it's a type of a meat dish. Melabnin ota le'afot achar kach בפלדון, ואם היה צריך ללבנה עד שהוא ניתזין, היה מתקלקל לגמרי. What he's saying is that if you were to do this, what ends up happening is that the sparks will end up completely destroying the tarpa, the utensil. And therefore, that's why we want to rely on just the heating it to the point where the straw will catch fire, which is a lower temperature. The Mordechai explains, another Rishon explains that this type of libun is not always effective. Rather, it's effective only in cases of hetera bala, which is where the absorbed substance is not forbidden at the time of absorption, e.g., chametz before Pesach, or dairy before it is mixed with meat, which reduces the leavening of kashering necessary. So I want to explain this. If I have a problem of chametz before Pesach and I want to kasher that pot, that chametz which is in the pot is known as hetera bal'a, something which is permitted was absorbed into the pan, and therefore I don't need to heat it to such a high temperature to remove it, which is not the case on Pesach itself. Once Pesach begins, then I'd have to heat it to a higher temperature. But before Pesach, I can be more lenient. The Mordechai says, and they are also accustomed to place straw on it from the outside to see if the straw is burned, that is sufficient, as if so, the libun takes hold from one side to the other, even though the outer layer does not come off. But nevertheless, this is sufficient, as since it's a case where it is permitted when absorbed, as I said, what's called hetera bala. If so, even hagala, even boiling water would be sufficient. So here we're going to learn an important leniency, especially in the Sephardic world, which is there are many cases in the Ashkenazic world where libun is the only way to kasher things. But there are many, many, many circumstances where, and I'm glad my wife is listening to this, where hagala, boiling water, is sufficient. And it's not a case of it's libun, it's fire, or throw it out. Often, boiling water will be enough. And this again is another machloket, Maran Rama. Says here, kelim shenishbashim bahem al yedei ha'ur, utensils that are used in fire, e.g. spits and grills and the like, Kigon shpudim vaskalot uchayotze bahem, like grills and this stuff. Tzrichim libun, they require libun. But libun hu ad shehu nitzotzot nitazin bahen, and libun is achieved where sparks are raised from them. Haga, the yesh mekilin, but there are those who are lenient. In nitlaben kolkach shekash nisrab alav mibachutz. ונוהגים כסברה ראשונה בכל דבר שדינו בליבון. And some are lenient if it has been made white hot to the point that straw would burn on it from the outside. And the custom is in accordance with the first opinion concerning any item for which the halacha requires libun. And there, Rav Eliezer Melamed mentions that this temperature is approximately 300 to 400 degrees Celsius, which is 700 to 800 degrees Fahrenheit. And I said this is very, very hot temperature. And that's why I say it's easier sometimes to say, I'm not going to bother kashering this thing for Pesach, I'm just going to put it away, because heating something to that temperature is very, very hard to do. And we're relying on this piece of shekash nisraf alav mibachutz, where the straw gets caught up on the outside, is hard to do. We're going to see, though, what are the cases where we might be lenient and we can do that position of the straw or even boiling water. The Mishnah Berurah writes, itazin mehen, where it is raised from them, or ad shetasur klipato elyona, or until the upper layer is removed. V'yesh mekilin, and there are those who are lenient if it has been made white hot. As this libun, although it is worse than libun chamor, it's nevertheless effective in that its heat expels the absorption, like hagalah, like boiling water. And this opinion holds that chametz is called hetera bala. It's absorbed a permissible thing before Pesach, and therefore we are lenient concerning this libun. In other words, you see footnote number 9 down the bottom there. In other words, the lenient opinion is limited to a case of hetera bala, as stated by the Mordechai, and chametz qualifies as such a case. Outside, this intent is that if one places straw on it on the outside, the straw will get burned due to the strength of the libun. And the custom is in accordance with the first position, as the strict halacha is in accordance with Rabbi Yosef Cairo, that chametz is isura bala, and therefore it needs a superior libun where sparks are raised from it. And even after the fact, it should be forbidden, but in a case of significant loss or prevention of rejoicing on Yom Tov, then we are lenient. And also there has to be Eino Ben Yomo, not used in the last 24 hours. Okay, so that's another way of getting out of it. So the explanation behind this is that libun chamor is needed in order to remove or destroy all that is absorbed within the utensil through fire, and libun kal will not suffice for this. However, libun kal is effective in cases of hetera bala, in accordance with Rav Avigdor and the Mordechai, since these types of food are more lenient. With respect to chametz, the Shulchan Aruch here seems to hold that it's considered a case of isura bala, and the Ramah holds to accept this as well in practice. Though he does mention the other side, but he also acknowledges that in other cases, they are definitely hetera bala, or may indeed use libun kal. There are a number of other cases as well where libun kal may be used, such as where it is uncertain whether the utensil actually requires kashering, or where the utensils are hard to clean completely due to cracks and crevices, and libun in such a case is effective even though hagalah is not. So here, I'm going to continue with this concept of kabbalah kachpolta, where how it absorbs is how it's going to go out as well. How does that work with regarding libun? We have seen that the method of kashering performed depends upon how the utensil was used, and it is kashered in that manner that it was used. With regard to hagalah kabbalah kachpolta, also determines which level of hagalah is necessary on the fire or a klisheni. Does the principle also dictate the details as to how libun is performed? If it does, then we might argue that any utensil that was never heated to the high temperature necessary to raise sparks should not be required to be subject to libun of that temperature either, but only to the highest temperature at which it was ever used. On the other hand, perhaps kabbalah kachpolta simply means that fire must be used as opposed to water, but the level of heat must always be that stated in the halacha, regardless of how the utensil is actually used, as that is the degree of burning required to burn out the flavor. The Piskei Teshuvah addresses this issue and explains that it is subject to, no surprise there, a machloket, a dispute. Does it need to go all the way to that heated temperature, or can it be relied on the temperature which it was used for? It says here, even if the usage of the utensils is not in a manner that raises sparks, nevertheless one must perform libun in the manner that raises sparks from it, since the rule of kabbalah kachpolta refers only to hagalah, boiling water, but it was not mentioned at all concerning libun, since libun does not expel the prohibited flavor, but rather burns it. Therefore, whether the absorption of the prohibited flavor in the utensil was through the heat of fire without water or sauce, one must perform libun chamor so that it raises sparks, as only this manner will burn the absorbed flavor. Whereas there are poskim who hold that the rule of kabbalah kachboto applies to libun too, since in their opinion the fire does expel the prohibited flavor. Therefore, if its usage and the prohibited flavor entering utensil occurred through the heat of fire, that is not at the level that raises sparks from it. So too, the libun does not need to be in the manner that raises sparks. However, he says, practically speaking, even though I just brought it, don't use this lenient position. Unless you have other reasons to be lenient. Because most poskim don't hold like this, and therefore you shouldn't do it that way. It's a bit interesting position, I think. It's I don't understand why you would bring a position and then say, you know what, as great as this position is, don't use it. Like, he'd be better off just saying, this is the position to go by, and just go with libun chamor. But it seems to be that libun chamor seems to be the easiest way to do it.
So I have a question, or maybe it'll be answered.
Sure.
It seems to me that putting utensils or flatware, etc., in boiling water, but this indicates that you would use fire on it?
No, so Sarah, this is for how it's used. So if your flatware, your silverware, all that kind of stuff, that never comes into direct contact with fire. So they do not require kashering with fire. He's only talking about here pots and pans which are directly on the fire, or baking pans in the oven, things of that nature.
Okay.
Something which is just coming to contact with hot foods, then hagala, boiling water, would be sufficient.
Okay, thanks.
Appreciate the question. I always like to clarify. I don't want anyone leaving here with more chumrot. I want to make sure we learn a few good leniencies too. Only joking. I just want people to know the halacha clearly. So here's the piece I was talking to John at the beginning about, which was when the utensils may get ruined, is there room to be lenient? There are some delicate utensils that may be ruined if one attempts to kasher them due to the high level of heat or boiling hot water. The Shulchan Aruch.
I'm sorry for interrupting you, but could you give an example of when you talk about utensils? I mean, what are we looking at? That's the part that I find confusing if we just sort of put everything in the category of utensils.
Yeah, so I think he's talking about here, he's talking about a pot that's going on the fire. So think of a frying pan, think of a saucepan, think of, again, I'm not the best for kitchen terms, a large soup pot, something like that. But again, we're going to describe this. It depends if there's liquid involved. If there's liquid involved, then it's not directly in the fire. So think of something which is going to have a dry heat. Because if there's liquid, there's going to be extra room to be lenient, as we're going to see in the next couple of sources. Okay, so saying here, the Shulchan Aruch quotes opinions that hold that these utensils cannot be kashered, since we suspect that even if one does try to do so, one may not perform the process properly due to fear that the utensil will be damaged or destroyed. And then he says here, Yesh Misha Omer, the kapot ha'asuyot mikeren. If I have spoons which are made from ivory or horn, ein lahen takana b'hagala. There's no way to even use boiling water. The kevan shemit kalkalin b'mayim chamin, since we know that they will be ruined in hot water. Chayshinan dil mechayis alayhu. We are concerned that perhaps he will protect it, which means he won't kasher it properly. This is also the ruling given by contemporary poskim, such as Rav Moshe Feinstein in cases of porcelain utensils, and Rav Melamed in the cases of disposable aluminum pots. He says here, utensils that are coated with a layer of porcelain, it seems more likely that libun cannot be performed on them since the coating becomes ruined, and we must be concerned the person will not perform libun properly, just as one may not perform libun on earthenware. Similarly, wonder pots designed for baking cakes absorb through fire, and one should have kashered them through libun chamor. But since they are made out of aluminum, they will not survive libun chamor, and there is no method of kashering them for Pesach. If one only bakes sponge cakes, there is room to be lenient to use hagalah, as was brought in halacha. As he says there, baking trays used in home ovens are also often severely damaged during libun chamor. They look grimy and their form gets twisted, such that for most people it's no longer usable. For this reason, one should not kasher them through libun. So it seems to be there that he's giving a position to use hagalah instead of the normal form of libun. Now, we're going to get into an interesting point about frying pans. How should they be kashered? Is that fire, and therefore it requires libun, or is there something else here? The Rishonim disagree over how one should kasher a frying pan, since one often uses a small amount of oil. Is this similar to utensils that are used with fire without liquid? Or does even a small amount of liquid, such as oil, qualify it for hagalah, requiring just boiling water? The Raviyah cites his father, Rabbeinu Yoel, who holds that you have to do libun, while the Raviyah himself argues with his own father and says that hagalah is sufficient. I love it when you have the situation where you have two rabbis, one's a father, one's a son, and the son has a different shita. Anyway, that's a shiur for another time. But both opinions are quoted by the Torah. The Torah says, you've got a machevet shemitaganen bo, you've got a frying pan. Katav Avia Ezri b'shem Avri Rabbeinu Yoel shetzricha libun. He quotes, Avi Ezri quotes his father, Rabbi Yoel. He says it requires libun. V'hu katav, but he himself writes, shedayor b'hagalah. It's enough just to do boiling water. Ulazeh, and this hiskim adoni Avi Arosh Zal. And this my father agreed to. And here the Rosh explains in more detail what's going on. And he says, concerning a frying pan, the Avi Ezri writes that it was told to me in the name of my father, my teacher, after his passing, that it requires libun, as he compares it to an oven used for baking, which requires fire. But I did not merit to discuss it before him. And that's the reason why he's able to disagree with him, by the way. As it seems to me that hagalah suffices, and this is the common practice. One reason is that we see that concerning the obligation for challah, the Gemara gives one rule to both frying and cooking. Moreover, the sages did not distinguish between one type of pot and another. Even though there are some pots in which people fry dairy, in addition, it is taught in the Tosefta that the large pots, samovars and small kettles, are washed in hot water, i.e., boiling water, hagalah. And some say that sometimes when one fries with it, the oil dries up, and what is inside is baked without oil and is equivalent to baking in the oven, and it is absorbed inside through the fire without liquid, and therefore it does require libun, like spits and grills. So the Shulchan Aruch rules that one should distinguish between the laws of Pesach and other prohibitions. And he says here, concerning a frying pan, even though regarding chametz and Pesach, just doing boiling water is enough. Regarding other prohibitions, one would require libun. And the Shach offers two reasons as to why to distinguish between Pesach dishes and those with other prohibitions. Number one, the Beit Yosef and the Levush suggest that when the frying pan absorbs chametz, the chametz is permitted at the time of the absorption. As we talked about, that was the hetera bala, i.e., it was when it was absorbed before Pesach. Likewise, if it absorbed meat And after 24 hours, when it's no longer ben yomah, it absorbed the dairy. The absorbed flavor was permitted one at that time. Therefore, we're more lenient, and therefore we can go with the lower level of kashering, which is boiling water. But if the frying pan absorbed the flavor of a non-kosher food, which it is forbidden at that time, then libun would be required. Okay, so therefore it's basically, is it hetera bala? Was it absorbed permitted flavor, or is it isura bala, absorption of forbidden flavor? And we're strict with the absorption of forbidden flavor, and therefore libun would be required, the fire. But if it was hetera bala, I could use hagala, I could use boiling water. An additional distinction is mentioned in the name of the Brahma Mipano, that in a frying pan belonging to non-Jews, the majority of usage is without water, but rather with a small amount of oil, as then the absorption takes place directly to the frying pan. Therefore, libun is required to kasher it. But regards to chametz, most of the time it's prepared using water, so absorption does not take place directly into the pan, but rather through a liquid medium, and therefore hagalah is sufficient. So here, Maramami Pano is giving a different reason. Although we're lenient with chametz, not because we're more lenient with chametz than other prohibitions, it's because chametz normally has water, and therefore because it has water, hagalah would be sufficient. Whereas the other use of cooking, they're normally doing it with only a small amount of oil, and therefore it's as if it's on the fire. And you can see the shach there in detail if you have time in source 23. Okay, now moving on. Rav Ovadia Yosef rules that the practical halacha is in accordance with the first approach, that as long as the substance absorbed was permitted at that time, what's known as hetera bala, then we can rely on hagalah. Okay? And so therefore, this is the Sephardic approach. When I want to kasher for normal use during the year to Pesach, I can do hagalah on frying pans and pots and pans. I can use just hagalah, and that makes it a lot easier to do the kashering process. Okay? And you can see that in detail in source number 24. Therefore, he says, just in the summary here, one may perform hagalah on a frying pan used for dairy that was mistakenly used for frying meat, only if it was used more than 24 hours after frying dairy, so it's not ben yomah. If non-kosher food was fried in the pan, or meat and dairy were fried within the same 24-hour period, then it would require libun, as this is considered isura bala, that it absorbed prohibited something. If libun chamor is performed, it is possible it may get ruined. Therefore, one approach is that it's better not to kasher it at all and throw it out. Another approach is that one should kasher it with libun kal, which is more likely to be effective and not ruin the pot. If we return to the question of kashering the frying pan for Pesach, where the Shulchan Aruch clearly ruled in Yoreh De'ah that boiling water hagalah may be performed, the Ramah in Orach Chaim writes that one should be stringent to require libun for Pesach as well. Though he qualifies that libun kal, where the heat reaches the level that straw is burnt, suffices, and libun chamor is not required. And here you see this in source 25. A frying pan may have hagalah performed on it for Pesach in order to kasher it, but the Ramah says, but some are stringent to perform libun on the pan, but only a lesser libun, which is libun kal, i.e. is sufficiently hot if straw is burnt on the outside. And the custom lechatchila is to do libun, but hagalah is sufficient if there are no holes.
So what is the minimum temperature in this case for hetera bala?
For the libun kal?
Yes.
That's a great question. I think it's more around the 300 or 400 Fahrenheit than the 700 or 800 Fahrenheit. It's a heat above boiling point, so it's not 212. It's something in between. So it's like 300 or 400. But that seems to be the normative position for Ashkenazic halacha, whereas for Sephardim, the approach is to again, when it's isur, when it's hetera bala, where it's something which was permitted was absorbed, then I can rely on this much lower temperature of 212, and it's not going to ruin the dishes and or the pots or the pans, and also it's a lot safer. A lot of people have told me that one of the reasons why they don't want to do it is not because they're worried about the pot, they're worried about hurting themselves or anyone else. And that's also an important concern. Just to finish off this part, this unit, the reason that libun kal may be used here is that the strict halacha is that Hagala works. And the requirement of performing libun is only a stringency. And that's what the Biur Halacha puts down here in 26. The Sefer Kashrut rules as well that libun kal suffices for a frying pan, and b'di'evet, even hagala in boiling water would suffice. Now, don't get me started, because I know many cases where Sfaradim go with a frying pan or a pot or whatever, and they want to do boiling water on it, and they're not allowed to, but when they go to an Ashkenazic synagogue. But there we go. I'm not going to get into too much, but it's important to understand the halacha here. Whoever wants to do libun kal, you know, good for them, but there's nothing wrong with doing hagala. He concludes here, we will conclude this section by noting that in addition to the specific ruling about frying pans, we can also see from the discussion here and the Biur Halacha cited above, that in any case where Hagala is required, libun kal can be performed instead. So you have these two positions of, you can use either this hotter than, it's colder than the libun chamor. It's not 700 or 800 Fahrenheit. It's a much less than that. It's probably 300 or maybe even 400 Fahrenheit, which again is hotter than using hagala, boiling water, which is about 212, 220, whatever that might be exactly. So here we're seeing that for Sfaradim, hagala seems to be the best position to go through on a lot of these situations, especially when it's hetera bala. And therefore, you've got hetera bala, and therefore I can do the hagala. I can do the boiling water to kasher it. And then I've also got this more strict position of the libun chamor, which is this very hot white heat of 800 degrees, 700 or 800 degrees Fahrenheit. The Ashkenazim came up with this middle ground position of libun kal, which they can do for hetera bala, but not for if it absorbed forbidden stuff. And when it's forbidden stuff, either you've got to throw it away, or you can, I think that's basically it. You're kind of stuck when it's an isur, an absolute isur has been absorbed. And so therefore, they're basically just different traditions of what became the normative position. For Ashkenazim, it's libun chamor is very hard, so we can get away with libun kal. Whereas for Sfaradim, hagala is the way to go in most scenarios. And if you can't do hagala because it requires libun chamor, you got a straight choice: either do the libun chamor or don't kasher it and don't use it. And that seems to be the basic position. Any questions until this point? I think this is a good time to stop, and we can pick it up next time with the next part of the unit. All right, let's stop here, and I'll see you all next week. Take care and have a good evening.